Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 9th Vice President of the United States, Richard Mentor Johnson. I am flying solo, of course, for the audio. Henry's not with me, except for that little introduction yesterday. That was about it. So for the remainder here, I am flying solo. Of course, part 1, we took a look at the early life and kind of early political rise and supposedly the killing of Tecumseh that Richard Mentor Johnson apparently did. We took a look at all of that and all those sorts of things in part 1. Now, part 2, today we're going to be taking a look at the election of 1836 and then his vice presidency and his time after vice president and the interesting marriage of him, Richard Mentor Johnson, and Julia Chinn, an enslaved woman. We're going to be getting into that. And then, of course, his death, his burial site there in Kentucky. I'll be showing you all of that. So there is some really awesome bonus footage that I want to show you guys today in part 2. So we're going to jump right in here. We're going to get right into this part 2 and jump right in so we can get to the bonus footage afterwards, because I know you guys are going to love that. So here we go. So first and foremost, as we like to do here, we're going to take a look at the election that obviously earned Richard Mentor Johnson the vice presidency. It was actually the election of 1836. It was actually, the nominees were Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, Hugh L. White, Daniel Webster, and Willie P. Magnum. That was the 1836 election. Interesting stuff. Basically, Vice President Martin Van Buren won. So he won the election. He became the 8th president of the United States. And his running mate was Richard Mentor Johnson of Kentucky. So taking a look here, you're probably seeing some of these maps and some of that sort of thing that I always like to show. And now I'm going to read you a little bit about the 1836 election. When the Democratic Convention met at Baltimore on May 22nd of 1835 to ratify Van Buren's nomination and select his running mate, Johnson's only serious opponent for the vice presidential nomination was former Senator William Cabell Rives of Virginia, or Rives, R-I-V-E-S, of Virginia, who had served as minister to France during Jackson's first administration. Southern Democrats and Van Buren himself strongly preferred Rives, although he counted the gallant colonel among the bravest of the braves. Van Buren also feared that Johnson could not be relied upon to check the cupidity of his friends. Jackson, however, concerned about the threat that the opposition candidate, Hugh Lawson White, posed among Western voters, strongly preferred his Kentucky lieutenant. His anger over Rives' diplomatic failures and his gratitude for Johnson's long-standing loyalty and support also weighed heavily in his decision. In spite of the president's considerable influence, however, Johnson received the required two-thirds vote only after New York Senator Silas Wright prevailed upon non-delegate Edward Rucker to cast the 15 votes of the absent Tennessee delegation in his favor. The choice provoked bitter dissension in Democratic ranks. Virginia delegate Dr. R.C. Mason questioned Johnson's fidelity to the party's great Republican principles and announced that his delegation would not support the nomination. Johnson's letter of acceptance explaining that I consider the views of President Jackson on the tariff and internal improvements as founded in true wisdom, failed to mollify the Virginians. Van Buren's ally, Albert Balk, had previously warned Jackson that, I do not think, from what I hear daily, that the nomination of Johnson for the vice presidency will be popular in any of the slaveholding states except Kentucky on account of his former domestic relations. And a Van Buren correspondent later predicted that Colonel Johnson's weight would absolutely sink the whole party in Virginia. Tennessee Supreme Court Chief Justice John Catron warned Jackson that Johnson was not only positively unpopular in Tennessee, but affirmatively odious, and begged the president to assure our friends that the humblest of us do not believe that a lucky random shot, even if it did hit Tecumseh, qualifies a man for the vice presidency. He predicted that the very moment that Colonel Johnson is announced, the newspapers will open up upon him with facts that he had endeavored often to force his daughters into society, that the mother in her lifetime and they now rode in carriages and claimed equality. Boy, oh boy. Unbelievable the times back then. The Whigs still formed a loose coalition bound by mutual opposition to Jackson's anti-bank policies, but lacked the party unity or organizational strength to field a single ticket or define a coherent platform. Instead of a single nominee, they offered a series of sectional candidates nominated by local caucuses in hopes of defeating Van Buren in each region and throwing the election into the House of Representatives. The Whig presidential candidates were Daniel Webster, Tennessee Senator and former Jacksonian Hugh Lawson White, and Johnson's former commander, General William Henry Harrison. For vice president, opposition caucuses nominated New York anti-Mason Francis Granger and former Democrat John Tyler of Virginia. In the bitter campaign that followed, Whigs attempted to attract disaffected Democrats by focusing on personalities rather than issues. In the South, opposition strategists raised the specter of abolition against Van Buren, while attacking Johnson as a great amalgamator who had habitually and practically illustrated abolitionist principles in his own home. Johnson not only cost his party Southern votes, but he also failed to attract Western votes as anticipated. His own state went for Harrison and Granger. In spite of these disappointments, however, Van Buren still managed a narrow victory with just over 50% of the popular vote. On February 8th of 1837, President pro tempore of the Senate, William R. King of Alabama, proclaimed to the members of Congress assembled in the House chamber to tally the electoral returns that Martin Van Buren, with 170 electoral votes, was the duly elected President of the United States. Johnson, however, received only 147 electoral votes, 70 more than his closest contender, Francis Granger, but one less than the number required to elect. The Virginia electors had remained loyal to Van Buren, who carried the state by a close margin, but cast their votes in the vice presidential contest for William Smith of Alabama. After King announced that it devolved on the Senate of the United States to choose a vice president of the United States, the Senate retired to its own chamber. After reassembling to elect the vice president, the Senate approved Tennessee Senator Felix Grundy's resolution to establish the voting procedure. The Secretary of the Senate shall call the names of senators in alphabetical order, and each senator will, when his name is called, name the person for whom he votes. And if a majority of the whole number of senators shall vote for either the said Richard M. Johnson or Francis Granger, he shall be declared by the presiding officer of the Senate constitutionally elected Vice President of the United States. Secretary of the Senate Asbury Dickens called the roll, with 49 of the 52 senators present voting along strict party lines, 33 for Johnson, 16 for Granger. President pro tempore King then announced that Richard Mentor Johnson had been constitutionally elected Vice President of the United States for 4 years, commencing on the 4th day of March, 1837. So now we're going to talk about the vice presidency, because obviously Richard Mentor Johnson then became the vice president under President Martin Van Buren. So here we go about his vice presidency. Notified of his election, Richard Mentor Johnson responded that his gratification was heightened from the conviction that the Senate, in the exercise of their constitutional prerogative, concurred with and confirmed the wishes of both the states and the people. He explained that he had never paid special regard to the minuteness of rules and orders, so necessary to the progress of business and so important to the observance of the presiding officer during his 3 decades in Congress. He was nonetheless confident, in words reminiscent of Jefferson's 40 years earlier, that the intelligence of the Senate will guard the country from any injury that might result from the imperfections of the presiding officer. While he hoped that there may be always sufficient unanimity to prevent equal divisions in the Senate, he would perform his duty without embarrassment in the event that he was called upon to cast a tie-breaking vote. President pro tempore King administered the oath of office to Richard Mentor Johnson in the Senate chamber at 10 a.m. on March 4th of 1837. In a brief address to the Senate, the new vice president observed that there is not, perhaps, a deliberative assembly existing where the presiding officer has less difficulty in preserving order. He attributed this characteristic to the intelligence and patriotism of the members who compose the body, and that personal respect and courtesy which have always been extended from one member to another in its deliberations. At the conclusion of his remarks, the ceremony of newly elected senators presenting their credentials to the Senate and taking the oath of office was temporarily interrupted by the arrival of President-elect Van Buren and his party. The senators, therefore, joined the procession to the east portico of the Capitol for the presidential inauguration. Contemporary witnesses and scholarly accounts of the day's festivities mention Richard Mentor Johnson only in passing, if at all. The outgoing president, worn and emaciated from 2 terms in office and a recent debilitating illness, but still towering over his immaculately attired successor, was clearly the focus of attention. Thomas Hart Benton, a dedicated Jackson supporter, later recounted the acclamations and cheers bursting from the heart and filling the air that erupted from the crowd as Jackson took his leave of the ceremony. From Benton's perspective, the rising was eclipsed by the setting sun. Johnson's friendship with Jackson and his stature in the House had assured him access to the president and some measure of influence during Jackson's administrations. The controversy surrounding his nomination, however, together with his disappointing showing in the 1836 election, his long-standing rivalry with Van Buren, and the constitutional limitations of his new office, severely curtailed his role in the Van Buren administration. Histories of Van Buren's presidency do not indicate that he ever sought his vice president's counsel. Johnson's duties were confined to the Senate chamber, where he watched from the presiding officer's chair as Senate Finance Committee Chairman Silas Wright of New York introduced Van Buren's economic program. Johnson was, however, willing to use on behalf of his friends and cronies the limited influence he still commanded. When Lewis Tappan asked the vice president to present an abolition petition to the Senate, Johnson, who owned several slaves, averred that considerations of a moral and political as well as of a constitutional nature prevented him from presenting petitions of a character evidently hostile to the Union and destructive of the principles on which it is founded. Constitutional considerations did not, however, prevent him from lobbying Congress on behalf of Indian subagent Samuel Milroy when Milroy, an Indiana Democrat who performed special favors for the vice president, sought the more lucrative position of Indian agent. Richard Mentor Johnson was a competent presiding officer, although not an accomplished parliamentarian. In keeping with Senate practice during the 1830s, he appointed senators to standing and select committees, a duty that President pro tempore William R. King performed when he was absent. Although he had hoped for equanimity in the Senate, Johnson was called upon to cast his tie-breaking vote 14 times during his single term in office, more frequently than any previous vice president except John Adams and John C. Calhoun. Three of his predecessors, Adams, George Clinton, and Daniel D. Tompkins, had addressed the Senate on occasion to explain their tie-breaking votes, but Johnson declined to do so. In at least one instance, however, he did explain a vote to readers of the Kentucky Gazette, justifying his support for a bill granting relief to the daughter of a veteran. Johnson reminded his former constituents that he had always used my humble abilities in favor of those laws which have extended compensation to the officers and soldiers who have bravely fought and freely bled in their country's cause, and to widows and orphans of those who perished. In other instances, however, Johnson voted with Democratic senators in support of administration policy. Notwithstanding his steady, if lackluster service in the Senate, Johnson, from the outset, represented a liability to Van Buren. Still heavily in debt when he assumed office, he hoped to recoup his fortunes through the Choctaw Academy. Choctaw? A school he established at Blue Spring Farm during the 1820s that became the focus of the Jackson administration's efforts to socialize and civilize the Native American population. He received federal funds for each student from tribal annuities and the Civilization Fund established by Congress during the Monroe administration, but revenues from the school failed to satisfy his mounting obligations. By the spring of 1839, Amos Kendall reported to Van Buren on the vice president's latest venture, a hotel and tavern at White Sulphur Spring, Kentucky. He enclosed a letter from a friend who had visited Colonel Johnson's watering establishment and found the vice president happy in the inglorious pursuit of tavern keeping, even giving his personal superintendence to the chicken and egg purchasing and watermelon selling department. Kendall wrote the consternation that Johnson's companion a young Delilah of about the complexion of Shakespeare's swarthy Othello, was said to be his third wife, his second, which he sold for her infidelity, having been the sister of the present lady. Although one of the most fashionable in Kentucky, Johnson's resort also formed a source of considerable embarrassment for the administration, as debts, disappointments, and the chronic pain he had suffered since 1813 took their toll. Johnson's once pleasing appearance became disheveled, and the plain Republican manners that had in earlier days so charmed Margaret Bayard Smith now struck observers as vulgar and crude, especially compared to the impeccably clad and consummately tactful Van Buren. Henry Stanton observed Johnson presiding over the Senate in 1838 and pronounced him shabbily dressed and to the last degree clumsy, a striking contrast with his urbane, elegant predecessor. English author Harriet Martineau sat opposite the vice president at a dinner party and predicted that if he should become president, he will be as strange looking a potentate as ever ruled. His countenance is wild, though with much cleverness in it. His hair wanders all abroad, and he wears no cravat. But there is no telling how he might look if he dressed like other people. The trademark scarlet vest that Johnson affected while vice president, after he and stagecoach line operator James Reside agreed to don vests to match Reside's red coaches, only accentuated his unkempt appearance and eccentric habits. Van Buren and Johnson took office just as weakened demand for American products abroad and credit restrictions imposed by British banks and trading houses combined to produce a massive contraction in the economy. Critics focused their wrath on Jackson's fiscal policies, which were in part responsible for the Panic of 1837. But Van Buren would not abandon his predecessor's hard money stance. He refused mounting demands to rescind the 1836 specie circular of Jackson's directive to end speculation and inflation by requiring purchasers of public land to pay in specie. During the September 1837 special session of Congress that Van Buren called to address the crisis, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Silas Wright of New York introduced the new administration's remedy, a proposal to end government reliance on the banking system. Congress finally approved Van Buren's independent Treasury plan in the summer of 1840, but not before bitter debate and the worsening economy galvanized the Whig opposition. Adding to Van Buren's considerable difficulties and contributing to Democratic losses in the 1837 and 1838 local elections were a border dispute with Canada, armed resistance to removal by the Seminole tribe in Florida, heightened sectional antagonism over slavery in Congress, and flagrant misconduct on the part of several administration appointees. So now we take a look at the 1840 campaign. Although Van Buren's renomination was never in doubt, Democratic strategists began to question the wisdom of keeping Johnson on the ticket in 1840. They feared, as Harriet Martineau had predicted, that the slavery question may again be to the disadvantage of the colonel. Even Jackson finally conceded that Johnson was a liability and insisted on former House Speaker James K. Polk of Tennessee as Van Buren's new running mate. "I like Colonel Johnson, but I like my country more," he wrote Francis P. Blair shortly before the Democratic convention, and I always go for my country first, and then for my friend. In spite of the entreaties of several Southern Democrats, anonymous hints in the Democratic press that Johnson would not stand for re-election, and his own half-hearted offer to withdraw from the contest if asked to do so, he remained a candidate. With William Henry Harrison, Johnson's former commander and comrade in arms and the hero of Tippecanoe, emerging as a likely Whig presidential contender, Van Buren was reluctant to drop the Democrats' own hero from the ticket. He was also well aware of Old Dick's following among hard money Democrats in the Northeast. Party leaders, unwilling to risk an open confrontation, approved Van Buren's compromise proposal that the 1840 convention would leave the selection of the vice presidential candidate to the state party organizations, but they ultimately backed Johnson after two crucial states, New York and Pennsylvania, rallied behind him, and other prospective candidates declined to run. Eastern Whigs feared that Clay could not win the presidency, as well as Harrison's surprising showing in the 1836 contest assured Harrison the 1840 Whig nomination. To balance his strength in the North and West, Whigs chose former Virginia Senator John Tyler as their vice presidential candidate. Whigs portrayed Harrison as a champion of the people and a welcome corrective to the New York dandy whose economic policies had failed to relieve widespread suffering among ordinary folk. Van Buren remained aloof from the popular hoopla that distinguished the 1840 campaign from earlier contests, despite Johnson's warning that the campaign would be hard run and that he ought to go out among the voters as I intended doing. The vice president plunged headlong into the fray, opening his shirt to display battle scars before an Ohio audience, revisiting the Battle of the Thames in progressively more lurid detail with each retelling, and delivering rambling diatribes on several occasions. He also always took care to remind Western audiences that Van Buren had raised himself from a poor Dutch orphan boy to the highest station in the world. During an Ohio campaign tour with Governor Wilson Shannon and Senator William Allen, the trio's inflammatory charges against Harrison touched off a riot in Cleveland. Still, as Robert Gray Gunderson concluded in his study of the Log Cabin Campaign, old Rumpsy Dumpsy conducted a more effective campaign than any other Democrat in 1840. Unprecedented public interest aroused by the campaign, coupled with broadened suffrage requirements in several states, ensured a record voter turnout. Harrison defeated Van Buren with 52.9% of the popular vote and 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60, and Whigs won majorities for the first time in both the House and the Senate. Johnson's showing was particularly embarrassing. Kentucky voters again backed the opposing ticket, but this time the Whigs carried the vice president's own district as well. One of the 23 Virginia electors and all of South Carolina's 11 electors voted for Van Buren, but defected to James K. Polk and Littleton W. Tazewell of Virginia, respectively, in the vice presidential contest. Richard Mentor Johnson had the painful duty of presiding over the joint session of Congress that met in the House chamber on February 10th of 1841 to count the electoral votes. After proclaiming Harrison's election, he announced that John Tyler was duly elected Vice President of the United States for 4 years, commencing with the 4th day of March, 1841. He then appointed Whig Senator William C. Preston of South Carolina to a joint committee to notify Tyler of his election, and 9 days later, he reported Tyler's acknowledgement of the message. So there you go, Johnson leaving office. Now a bit about his later years and farewell and everything. Richard Mentor Johnson took his leave of the Senate on March 2nd of 1841, the day before the 26th Congress adjourned, to allow the Senate an opportunity of selecting a presiding officer for the convenience of organization when the next Congress convened 2 days later. Recalling his association with a very great majority of the members of the Senate for many years in the councils of our common country, he reflected that his personal relations with them had ever been kind and tender, notwithstanding diversity of opinion on minor points or points of greater magnitude. The generous, the magnanimous course of individual senators, and particularly their indulgence of a presiding officer who never studied the rules of order technically, had rendered his service in the Senate pleasant and agreeable, despite momentary agitation and excitement in debate. As the Senate presiding officer, he had tried to act with perfect impartiality and to treat each senator as the representative of a sovereign and independent state, and as entitled to equal consideration of me. Johnson claimed that he retired without the least dissatisfaction, obedient to the great radical and fundamental principle of submission to the voice of the people, when constitutionally expressed, but his parting comments betrayed a sense of regret. And when I am far distant from you, as time must separate us all even here, not to speak of hereafter, as long as I shall have my recollection to remember the associations which I have had with this body, I shall always be animated by the sentiment of kindness and friendship with which I take my final leave of the Senate. Richard Mentor Johnson's 1840 defeat effectively ended his political career. He was a candidate for the Senate in 1842, but lost to John J. Crittenden. Early efforts by Kentucky Democrats to secure the 1844 Democratic presidential nomination for Colonel Dick and his own tours of the northern states and the Mississippi Valley toward that end met with polite but condescending resistance from Democrats who shared William L. Marcy's view that he is not now even what he formerly was. It may be there was never so much of him as many of us were led to suppose. Jackson was characteristically blunt. Johnson, he warned Van Buren, would be dead weight in the forthcoming election. An observer noted the old hero's mounting frustration. Colonel Dick Johnson seems to understand very well that Mr. Van Buren is stacking the cards. Dick will be bamboozled as sure as a gun. You never saw a more restless, dissatisfied man in your life than Dick is. By 1843, Johnson's partisans conceded that he had no chance of winning the presidential nomination, and a Kentucky Democrat assured Van Buren that the friends of Colonel Johnson do not ask anything more than a vote on the first ballot in his favor. Several Democrats speculated that Johnson's real objective was the vice presidential nomination, although he never formally declared himself a candidate. But by early 1844, he realized that his party doesn't even intend to place him upon the vice president ticket. Richard Mentor Johnson made a final attempt to return to the Senate in 1848, but the Kentucky legislature sent his old colleague and adversary, Henry Clay, to Washington. Scott County voters elected Johnson to the state legislature 2 years later, but he was gravely ill when he took his seat on November 8th of 1850. Shortly after, the Louisville Daily Journal reported that it is painful to see him on the floor attempting to discharge the duties of a member. Johnson suffered a stroke. He died on November 19th of 1850, and by resolution of the Kentucky legislature, was buried at the Frankfort Cemetery. State Senator Beriah McGoffin eulogized the frontier hero as Johnson would have wished to be remembered. He was the poor man's friend, void of ostentation, simple in his taste, his manners, and his dress, brave, magnanimous, patriotic, and generous to a fault. In his earliest years, he was the beau ideal of the soul and the chivalry of Kentucky. So there you have it. Richard Mentor Johnson, our 9th Vice President of the United States. That's kind of his whole political career, vice presidency, all that good stuff. I am going to read you a couple quick things, some kind of facts about him. Then I'm going to read you a couple very interesting things. Just here at later life and death. After his term as vice president, Johnson returned to Kentucky to tend to his farm and oversee his tavern. He again represented Scott County in the Kentucky House from 1841 to 1843. In 1845, he served as a pallbearer when Daniel Boone was reinterred in Frankfort Cemetery. Johnson never gave up on a return to public service. He ran an unsuccessful campaign for the U.S. Senate against John J. Crittenden in 1842. He briefly and futilely sought his party's nomination for president in 1844. He also ran as an independent candidate for governor of Kentucky in 1848, but after talking with the Democratic candidate Lazarus W. Powell, who had replaced Lynn Boyd on the ticket, Johnson decided to drop out and back Powell. Some speculated that the real object of his campaign was to secure another nomination to the vice presidency, but this hope was denied. Johnson finally returned to elected office in 1850 when he was elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives. By this time, however, his physical and mental health was already failing. On November 9th, the Louisville Daily Journal reported that Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson is laboring under an attack of dementia, which renders him totally unfit for business. It is painful to see him on the floor attempting to discharge the duties of a member. He is incapable of properly exercising his physical or mental powers. Richard Mentor Johnson died of a stroke on November 19th, just 2 weeks into his term, at age 70. He was interred in the Frankfort Cemetery in Frankfort, Kentucky. Ruling that his surviving daughter, Imogene, was illegitimate, the Frankfort County Court split his estate between his brothers, John and Henry. A little bit about his legacy. Counties in 4 U.S. states are named for Johnson, namely in Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, and Nebraska. Richard Mentor Johnson is also the namesake of Dick Johnson Township, Indiana. In 2021, Johnson County, Iowa, which had been named for Johnson since its founding, chose to deem itself to be bearing the name of a black Iowan. His political prominence led to a family dynasty. His brothers James and John Telemachus Johnson and his nephew Robert Ward Johnson were all elected to the House of Representatives. The first two from Kentucky and Robert from Arkansas. Robert was later elected as a senator before the Civil War. So there you have it, a little bit about his late life and legacy. Now we are going to get into, well, first, before I get into this, the marriage, the fascinating marriage, of course, I'm going to read you an article on Johnson It's from 2019. It's actually was in the Northern Kentucky Tribune, in October of 2019. It's a short article, but I want to read it to you. It says, Kentucky by heart. Kentucky Senator Richard Mentor Johnson led an interesting and controversial life. So I'm going to read you this. It's an article by a man by the name of Steve Flaherty. And I'm going to read you what he wrote here. I have been reading the U.S. Senate and the Commonwealth University Press of Kentucky 2019 by Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell and Roy Brownwell II. It focuses on an overall study of Senate leadership, along with a fascinating look at what the book calls the colorful and vivid lives of 15 Kentucky lawmakers, including Henry Clay, Alben Barkley, and John Sherman Cooper. To the author's credit, it appears that the book is not slanted toward a partisan viewpoint, and the historical accounts are detailed but easily read. Surprisingly for me, I found the profile of Richard Mentor Johnson, born in 1780 in Jefferson County, as one of the most fascinating. Why? It's because he was a mixture of both the very good and very bad in regard to his overall performance in public life. In fact, he often presented himself as a picture of controversial behavior. His father, Robert Johnson, served in the Kentucky legislature, though later lost races for the U.S. Congress and state lieutenant governor. It appears that Richard never attended college, and the book said that he was not known for his intellectual curiosity. However, he studied law under a lawyer's tutelage and became one in 1802. He served 2 years in the Kentucky legislature, and then was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served from 1806 to 1819. His social skills demonstrated while in Congress were reportedly good. One source said that Richard Johnson had the rare quality of being personally liked by everyone. Despite that attribute, it's odd that he did not seem to care much about his appearance. One person called him shabbily dressed while at a White House dinner, and it was not a rare occurrence. In the midst of his congressional term, he volunteered to command a Kentucky unit in the War of 1812, and, said the book, he displayed great valor. It's reported that during the Battle of Thames, he killed the iconic Shawnee chief Tecumseh, though it has not been substantiated. Regardless, he received great recognition for his bravery. He also came out of the war with injuries to an arm and leg, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. Getting back to his political service after the war, he secured adoption of the Compensation Act, which changed the congressional pay rate from a per diem basis to an annual salary. It drew fierce pushback from voters, however, and he promised to repeal it. That likely saved his career, at least for a while. In another controversial move at that time, Richard defended a couple of noted American military generals, William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, against charges of malfeasance, and that meant that he was pitted against fellow Kentuckian Henry Clay, then the House Speaker, not helpful to his political career at that point. Also on the negative side of things during his time in Congress, he supported two projects: the Yellowstone Expedition, along with the establishment of the Choctaw Academy, a school for Native American youths. Both were reputed to be conflicts of interest with his personal businesses. And in what sounds quite bizarre, in 1822, Richard Johnson supported giving funds for a plan to explore the center of the earth. The plan was based on the idea that a void existed at the Earth's core, and to access the planet's interior, a team of explorers would need to enter a passageway that supposedly existed in the Arctic Circle. Ideally, the project would have 100 men driving reindeer and sleigh to the North Pole and descend into the core of the earth. However, a committee studied it and it failed in the Senate, though it did have some significant support. Alas, and perhaps because of his noted affability and despite his inconsistent record, he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1819 and served until 1829. He got pretty good reviews, particularly for his leadership sustained over many years in ending imprisonment for debtors. He also worked to make the cost of federal land more affordable. Helping causes for economically vulnerable U.S. citizens became a hallmark of his service. He became a member of the Jacksonians, supporting Andrew Jackson over John Quincy Adams in the 1824 presidential election. That further alienated the supporters of Henry Clay, and that proved hurtful to his political career. Richard would not extend his term in the U.S. Senate, but he did win in his race for the House of Representatives again, and served from 1829 to 1837. He had run for vice president under Martin Van Buren in 1836, not securing the number of electoral votes needed, but got elected to the post under provisions of the 12th Amendment, starting his term in 1837. He mostly did not distinguish himself as vice president, developing a bit of a reputation for spending time away from the chamber and tending bar at the inn he owned back home in Kentucky. Andrew Jackson took away his support for Richard, and he was dropped from the ticket for the 1840 election. He also carried some well-known baggage. He cohabitated with a slave mistress, Julia Chinn, and after her death, started another such relationship with Patience Chinn, possibly related to Julia. He never married, but had 2 children with Julia. After he was ousted as a vice presidential candidate, he ran for the Kentucky state legislature and won. But the Kentucky governor called Richard Johnson a restless, dissatisfied man in that role. Ironically, he then set his sight on running for the U.S. presidency, but as you might already know, that did not work out. For Richard Mentor Johnson, his political record was spotty, but he sure was an interesting person. So that was a cool article, I thought. Kind of mentions the relationship with Patience Chinn, not Julia Chinn, which is interesting. We're going to get into this very shortly here regarding his relationship with Julia Chinn. All right, so now, folks, listen. To me, this is the most fascinating thing regarding Richard Mentor Johnson. So when I started really studying and researching Richard Mentor Johnson, I learned that he had a relationship with an enslaved woman named Julia Chinn. And he had 2 children with Miss Julia Chinn. He had his 2 children. There was 2 of them. One of them was, is it Imogene? Let me just get the names here real quick for you, because I don't want to miss that. His one daughter was, Imogene Malvina Johnson Pence. And then his other daughter, I do know the other one. Hold on, let me just find it here for you. There it is. I apologize. So it was Imogene Chinn Johnson and Adeline Chinn Johnson. So those were the 2 children that he had with Julia Chinn. So this is quite remarkable to me, because the reason that this is so remarkable, this story, when I started researching this, I was like, well, let me see, let me try to figure this out about Richard Mentor Johnson, what's interesting. And then I found that he had this relationship with this enslaved woman, Julia Chinn, and I was like, whoa, and he had children with her, and this was fascinating to me, so fascinating. I mean, the reality is, and this is what fascinated me about this so much, Richard Mentor Johnson was the 9th vice president under Martin Van Buren. Okay, imagine, I mean, this is, like 1837, 1838, late 1830s. This is before real modern, like really good medicine and, before most antibiotics and all that stuff were around, obviously. Imagine if Van Buren gets sick, eats some bad fruit or bad meat, and dies of a bacterial infection or something. Richard Mentor Johnson then takes over as the President of the United States, and the First Lady would be an enslaved woman named Julia Chinn, because Richard Mentor Johnson and Julia Chinn were common law married. It was a common law marriage. So, like, all these questions started building in my head. Like, would this have been I know the times, of course, 1837 or so. Would that have been even recognized? Would she have even been addressed as First Lady? Because Johnson himself, at least from what I've read, I could be wrong, Johnson himself seemed to really not be shy about this relationship. He didn't deny it. He didn't, say it didn't exist. He was pretty open about his relationship with her for the most part. So here, I'm going to read you some things about this whole marriage and relationship. Family tradition holds that Johnson broke off an early marital engagement when he was about 16 because of his mother's disapproval. Purportedly, Johnson vowed revenge for his mother's interference. His former fiancée later gave birth to his daughter named Celia, who was raised by the Johnson family. Celia Johnson later married Wesley Fancher, one of the men who served in Johnson's regiment at the Battle of the Thames. After his father died, Richard Johnson inherited Julia Chinn, an octoroon mixed-race woman, 7/8 European and 1/8 African in ancestry, who was born into slavery around 1790. She had grown up in the Johnson household where her mother served. Julia Chinn was the daughter of Benjamin Chinn, who was living in Malden, Upper Canada, or London, Canada, and a sister of Daniel Chinn. An 1845 letter from Newton Craig, keeper of the penitentiary in Frankfort, Kentucky, to Daniel Chinn mentions another brother of Julia Chinn named Marcellus, who accompanied Colonel Johnson on his first electioneering tour for vice presidency. Marcellus left Colonel Johnson in New York, whereupon Colonel Johnson tried to find Marcellus's whereabouts from Arthur Tappan, Esquire. Though Chinn was legally Johnson's concubine, he began a long-term relationship with her and treated her as his common-law wife. They had 2 daughters together, and she later became manager of his plantation. Both Johnson and Chinn championed the notion of a diverse society. By their multiracial, predominantly white family, they were prohibited from marrying because she was a slave. When Johnson was away from his Kentucky plantation, he authorized Chinn to manage his business affairs. She died in the widespread cholera epidemic that occurred in the summer of 1833. Johnson deeply grieved her loss. The relationship between Johnson and Chinn shows the contradictions within slavery at the time. There were certainly numerous examples that kin could also be property. Johnson was unusual for being open about his relationship and treating Chinn as his common-law wife. He was heard to call her my bride on at least one occasion, and they acted like a married couple. According to oral tradition, other slaves at Great Crossings were said to work on their wedding. Chinn gradually gained more responsibilities. As she spent much of her time in the plantation's big house, a 2-story brick home, she managed Johnson's estate for at least half of each year, with her purview later expanding to all of his property, even acting as Richard's representative and allowing her to handle money. This gave, as historical scholar Christina Snyder argues, some independence, since Johnson told his white employees that Chinn's authority must be respected, and her role allowing her children's lives to be different from others of African descent at Great Crossings, giving them levels of privileged access within the plantation. This was further complicated by the fact that Chinn was still enslaved but supervised the work of slaves, which the Chinn family never sold or mortgaged off. But she did not have the power to challenge the institution of slavery or overturn the government that supported it. She only had the power to gain some personal autonomy, with Johnson never legally emancipating her. This may have been because, as Snyder says, liberating her from human bondage would erode ties that bound her to him, and keeping her enslaved supported his idea of being a benevolent patriarch. Johnson and Chinn had two daughters, Adeline Chinn Johnson and Imogene Chinn Johnson, whom he had not acknowledged and gave his surname to, with Johnson and Chinn preparing them for a future as free women. Johnson taught them morality and basic literacy, with Julia undoubtedly teaching her own skills, with both later pushing for both of them to receive regular academic lessons, which he later educated at home to prevent the scorn of neighbors and constituents. Later, Johnson would provide for Adeline and Imogene's education. Both daughters married white men. Johnson gave them large farms as dowries from his own holdings. There is confusion about whether Adeline Chinn Scott had children. A 2007 account by the Scott County History Museum said that she had at least one son, Robert Johnson Scott, with husband Thomas W. Scott, who became a doctor in Missouri. Myers said that she was childless. There is also disagreement about the year of her death. Bevins writes that Adeline died in 1833 from cholera epidemic. Myers writes she died in 1837. The Library of Congress notes that she died in February of 1836. Okay. Although Johnson treated these two daughters as his own, according to Myers, the surviving Imogene was prevented from inheriting his estate at the time of his death. The court noted she was illegitimate and so without rights in this case. Upon Johnson's death, the Fayette County Court found that he left no widow, children, father, or mother living. It divided his estate between his living brothers, John and Henry. Bevins's account, written for the Georgetown and Scott County Museum, says that Adeline's son, Robert Johnson Scott, her first cousin, Richard M. Johnson Jr., and Imogene's family, husband Daniel Pence, first daughter Malvina, and son-in-law Robert Lee, and second daughter and son-in-law Josiah Pence, acquired Johnson's remaining land after his death. After Chinn's death, Johnson began an intimate relationship with another family slave. When she left him for another man, Johnson had her picked up and sold at auction. Afterward, he began a similar relationship with her sister, who was also a slave. Oh boy, this is just fascinating to me. So here we go, getting more into this. Reading a little bit more. For all his military and political prowess, Richard Johnson's greatest legacy may be the family scandal he brought to Washington, D.C. Sometime around the death of his father in 1815, he acquired an enslaved woman named Julia Chinn. Her exact origins remain a mystery, but supporters claimed she was an octoroon, a term then used to describe a person who was of 1/8 African descent. They developed a relationship and had two daughters, but under Kentucky law, Johnson could not legally marry her even if he wished to. She remained his common-law wife. Julia was by many accounts a devoted mother, made sure their daughters had an education, and was a competent manager of his plantation. It was not unusual for an enslaver to sexually assault enslaved women, and children from these violent unions were rarely acknowledged and typically remained enslaved as well. The relationship between Johnson and Julia Chinn was more complex. Although we do not have records of Chinn's thoughts on the union, Johnson's recognition and fondness for his children is quite well documented. The crime Johnson was charged with was expecting society to accept his daughters as equals. Julia Chinn died in 1833 during a cholera epidemic, still legally enslaved, and Johnson began physical relationships with other enslaved women. These encounters seemed much more characteristic of most interactions forced on enslaved women by enslavers, and Johnson eventually sold these women and their children. All these situations combined made Johnson an incredibly well-known but controversial man. What else can I tell you here? Hold on one sec. The death of Richard Johnson's wife and daughter Adeline, plus personal attacks on himself, began to take their toll on his physical and emotional health. That's just a little bit kind of about his later life. It goes into there. Upon returning home to Kentucky, Richard Johnson made several more attempts to seek elected office. The last years of his life were a mixture of depression and failure. And died of a stroke, as we said. This is fascinating, this whole Julia Chinn thing. Now I'm going to read you an article that, believe it or not, was in the Washington Post only earlier this year, in February of 2021. It's an article by Ronald G. Schaefer of the Washington Post, and the title of the article is, "He became the nation's 9th vice president. She was his enslaved wife." So, let's read you that article. It's not very long, but I got to read you this. So, here you go. Her name was Julia Chinn. She was born enslaved and remained that way her entire life, even after she became Richard Mentor Johnson's bride. Johnson, a Kentucky congressman who eventually became the nation's 9th vice president in 1837, could not legally marry Julia Chinn. Instead, the couple exchanged vows at a local church with a wedding celebration organized by the enslaved people at his family's plantation in Great Crossing, according to Miriam Biskin, who wrote about Chinn decades ago. Chinn died nearly 4 years before Johnson took office, but because of controversy over her, Johnson is the only vice president in American history who failed to receive enough electoral votes to be elected. The Senate voted him into office. So there you go. I was wrong earlier. I misspoke when I said that an enslaved woman would have been First Lady because she had died before he actually took office. But that still leads to, there's still some interesting things, because say she had lived and he was obviously vice president. So the question still comes up for me. Would she have been recognized as First Lady if he would have ever been taken over as president? I mean, it's just fascinating. So continuing on with this article, the couple's story is complicated and fraught, historians say. As an enslaved woman, Chinn could not consent to a relationship, and there is no record of how she regarded him. Though she wrote to Johnson during his lengthy absences from Kentucky, the letters did not survive. Amrita Myers, who is working on a book about Chinn, wrote about the hurdles in a blog post for the Association of Black Women Historians. I'm sure Amrita Myers, it's actually Dr. Amrita Myers, her middle name. I'm sure I butchered it. I apologize. But this is what Dr. Myers said. While doing my research, I was struck by how Julia had been erased from the history books, wrote Myers, a history professor at Indiana University. Nobody knew who she was. The truth is that Julia and Richard are both victims of legacies of enslavement, interracial sex, and silence around black women's histories. He was elected. Now, Johnson's life, of course, is far better documented, as we know. He was elected as a Democrat to the state legislature in 1802 and to Congress in 1806. The folksy, handsome Kentuckian gained a reputation as a champion of the common man. Back home in Great Crossing, he fathered a child with a local seamstress, but did not marry her when his parents objected, according to the biography, The Life and Times of Colonel Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky. Then, in about 1811, Johnson, 31, turned to Chinn, 21, who had been enslaved at Blue Spring Plantation since childhood. Johnson called Chinn my bride. His great pleasure was to sit by the fireplace and listen to Julia as she played on the pianoforte. Biskin wrote in her account. The couple soon had 2 daughters, Imogen and Adeline. Johnson gave his daughters his last name and openly raised them as his children. Johnson became a national hero during the War of 1812. At the Battle of the Thames in Canada, he led a horseback attack on the British and their Native American allies. He was shot 5 times, but kept fighting. During the battle, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh was killed. In 1819, Colonel Dick was elected to the U.S. Senate. When he was away in Washington for long periods, he left Chinn in charge of the 2,000-acre plantation and told his white employees they should act with the same propriety as if I were home. Chinn's status was unique. While enslaved women wore simple cotton dresses, Chinn's wardrobe included fancy dresses that turned heads when Richard hosted parties, Christina Snyder wrote in her book, Great Crossings, Indian Settlers and Slaves in the Age of Jackson. In 1825, Chinn and Johnson hosted the Marquis de Lafayette during his return to America. In the mid-1820s, Johnson opened on his plantation the Choctaw Academy, a federally funded boarding school for Native Americans. He hired a local Baptist minister as director. Chinn ran the academy's medical ward. Julia is as good as one of half the physicians where the complaint is not dangerous, Johnson wrote in a letter. He paid the academy's director extra to educate their daughters for a future as free women. Johnson tried to advance his daughters in local society, and both would later marry white men. But when he spoke at a local July 4th celebration, the Lexington Observer reported prominent white citizens would not let Adeline sit with them in the pavilion. Johnson sent his daughter to his carriage, rushed through his speech, and then angrily drove away. When Johnson's father died, he willed ownership of Chinn to his son. He never freed his common-law wife. Whatever power Chinn had was dependent on the will and the whims of a white man who legally owned her, Snyder wrote. Then in 1833, Chinn died of cholera. It is unclear where she is exactly buried. Johnson went on to greater national prominence. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson backed Vice President Martin Van Buren as his successor. At Jackson's urging, Van Buren, a fancy dresser who had never fought in war, picked war hero Johnson as his running mate. Nobody knew how the Shawnee chief was slain in the War of 1812, but Johnson's campaign slogan was, Rumpsy Dumpsy, Johnson killed Tecumseh. Johnson's relationship with Chinn became a campaign issue. Southern newspapers denounced him as the Great Amalgamationist. A mocking cartoon showed a distraught Johnson with a hand over his face bewailing the scurrilous attacks on the mother of my children. Van Buren won the election, but Johnson's 147 electoral votes were one short of what he needed to be elected. Virginia's electors refused to vote for him. It was the only time Congress chose a vice president. When Van Buren ran for re-election in 1840, Democrats declined to nominate Johnson at their Baltimore convention. It is the only time a party did not pick any vice presidential candidate. The Spelling Challenge Jackson warned that Johnson would be a dead weight on the ticket. Old Dick still ended up being the leading choice and campaigned around the country wearing his trademark red vest. But Van Buren lost to Johnson's former commanding officer, General William Henry Harrison. Johnson never remarried, but he reportedly had sexual relationships with other enslaved women who could not consent to them. The former vice president won a final election to the Kentucky legislature in 1850, but he died a short time later at the age of 70. His brothers laid claim to his estate at the expense of his surviving daughter, Imogene, who was married to a white man named Daniel Pence. At some point in the early 20th century, Myers wrote, perhaps because of heightened fears of racism during the Jim Crow era, members of Imogene Johnson Pence's line, already living as white people, chose to stop telling their children that they were descended from Richard Mentor Johnson and his black wife. It was not until the late 20th century that younger Pences, by then already in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, began discovering the truth of their heritage. Truly, unbelievably incredible this is. I mean, it's incredible to me. This fascinated me. This whole story fascinated me. I can't even explain to you guys how much this fascinated me. So, with all of that, I wanted to kind of let you guys know, before I wrap this up here in part 2, there is bonus footage. Now, the aforementioned Dr. Amrita Myers of Indiana University. She has a book coming out in 2022. It is called The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. Well, guess what? I am going to personally interview Dr. Amrita Myers and discuss this topic for a few minutes regarding Richard Mentor Johnson and Julia Chinn. I cannot wait. This is going to be awesome. So stay tuned in the bonus footage for that. So to kind of wrap this up, I'm going to show you pictures here, just a couple pictures. This is Richard Mentor Johnson's gravesite. Richard Mentor Johnson is buried at the Frankfort Cemetery in Frankfort, Kentucky. It is a very big, nice monument. It's really pretty cool. It's surrounded by this like circle, and it's got all these American flags there. I liked it. I thought it was cool. And the really cool thing is, Daniel Boone's buried, like, no exaggeration, probably like 50 yards from where he is. So it's really pretty cool. So he's there. Daniel Boone's there, like 50 yards from him. And as you can see from these pictures that I took, it's a very nice, really cool monument and memorial gravesite. It's got his face etched into the side, into the stone, into the marble. It's really cool. It is very cool. So that is the gravesite of Richard Mentor Johnson. We're going to get into more of that here in the bonus footage. And, of course, that interview with Dr. Myers. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed this part 2, guys. This look at the life, legacy, vice presidency, death, and unbelievable, interesting, and controversial marriage to a Julia Chinn, an enslaved woman. Obviously, all of this regarding Richard Mentor Johnson, our 9th Vice President of the United States. Hope you guys enjoyed this next vice presidential installment here at Dead History. stay tuned because, of course, next week we are going to put out another video. This will be weekly as it always is. We're no longer having a break. And next week technically would be John Tyler, but since we're skipping the vice presidents who became president, next week will be George Mifflin Dallas, the 11th Vice President of the United States. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, guys. Thank you for all the support, the love, all of it. Please leave those comments, questions. Love to hear from you guys. Thank you so very much. Henry and I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned for the bonus footage. This is going to be awesome, I promise. And I will see you next week. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now. Hey, guys. TJ with Dead History here, of course. And I am joined today by a very special guest. I want to get all of her credentials correct. I am joined by Dr. Amrita Myers. She is an associate professor of history and gender studies at Indiana University. Her main focus is mostly on Black women's history in the slave South. And did I get all that right, Dr. Myers?
Yes, you did. Thank you, TJ.
Well, welcome. Thank you so much. And the reason that I have you here to talk a little bit today is because, as I explained to you in my email, I kind of do this whole presidential and vice presidential series, and I bring, in chronological order, a new person each week. And this week happened to be, of course, Richard Mentor Johnson, the 9th Vice President of the United States. And as I was researching Mr. Johnson, I learned, of course, of Julia Chinn, and I was completely overwhelmed, fascinated with this story and all of these interesting things about this. And when I started researching more and more, I found Dr. Myers' information and learned that Dr. Myers has a book coming out. Is it next year? Is it slated to come out in 2022?
Well, it's actually slated to come out in January or February of 23. So,
okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. Great. So, and the title of the book is The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. And when I found out that Dr. Myers was obviously writing a book about this, I was like, I have to try to get in touch with this lady and find out if she will speak to me, because I'm sure my subscribers and audience will be fascinated with this just like I am. So again, Dr. Myers, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And please, if you could tell, first of all, I have to bring this up. I saw a graduate of Rutgers University. Is that correct?
Yes, I did my doctoral work at Rutgers, New Brunswick. So I'm a proud PhD alum of Rutgers in New Jersey.
Very cool. There you go. That's great to hear. So there you go. This makes it even more cool for me because, of course, I'm a Jersey boy, born and raised, and I only live about 30 minutes or so from Rutgers there in New Brunswick. So very, very cool. Now tell me, what got you involved and fascinated to research and study this particular subject of Julia Chinn, and what made you want to write this book? Please tell me.
Well, actually, it grew out of the work that I did on my first book, which was on enslaved and free Black women in Charleston, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And as I was finishing up that book, the last 2 chapters of that book are case studies on interracial families and interracial couples in antebellum Charleston, South Carolina. And those chapters were really incredibly important to me. I really, really loved researching them and writing them. But it's very, very difficult to find enough information on enslaved and free Black women in the antebellum period to be able to write whole chapters, let alone entire books, because the source materials, the information, the record base is so fragmentary. Because it was illegal for Black people in the antebellum period to get an education, to learn how to read and write. They had to do so, often illegally, like undercover. in bits and pieces. And even in the North, when, even though slavery was abolished in the North, it was very difficult for Black people to establish schools and get an education because white people were very hostile to Black people setting up schools and learning how to read and write. So, the sources are very difficult to find. So the fact that I was able to actually, in that larger book on Charleston, that I was able to find enough information to write 2 chapters on individual Black women and their families was really just a miracle that I was able to do that. And I really thought to myself, this is what I really would love to do, is be able to find one woman and be able to do a longer deep dive project and write an entire book on one woman and her family. And as I was finishing up that book project, I didn't think I'd ever be able to do that because of the lack of source material. But I came across this mention in a larger U.S. history survey textbook. I was getting ready to teach U.S. history part 1, the big survey class, from contact to the Civil War in 1 semester, because that's actually, that's a freshman level class. That's one of the classes that I teach here. I teach everything from basic intro U.S. history all the way to PhD classes. Mm-hmm. And so as I was getting ready to teach U.S. history part 1, I was prepping, reading survey textbooks, getting my notes together. And I came across mention of this, Vice President of the United States, Richard Mentor Johnson, and his very unusual life. And his very unique love life and it was not really a complimentary mention, let's be clear, because they were talking about how Northerners and abolitionists in the 19th century really used people like Johnson to talk about a rationale and a reason for why slavery needed to be abolished. Like, they had a lot of reasons for why slavery needed to be abolished, but he was like one more example for why slavery should be abolished, because here are all of these Southern politicians who keep getting reelected to office, even though they abuse their enslaved laborers. They rape them, they have sexual relationships with them. And so in order to protect Black women, we need to abolish slavery so that we can make sure that Black women are not being raped and sexually assaulted and taken advantage of. Because look, here are men like Richard Mentor Johnson who have multiple quote unquote concubines and mistresses. And I thought to myself, who is this man? I'm a 19th century historian. I've actually never really heard of him. And he was he was, for 40 years, he was in politics. He was a congressman. He was a congressman, he was a senator, and he was the 9th Vice President of the United States. And I thought to myself, how have I never heard of this person? And so it actually made me, I sort of put a pin in it because I was finishing up the first book, but then I sort of went back and did a little more research online, and there was really very little about him or these supposed multiple sort of women that he had relationships with. All of whom were enslaved women. Johnson never married anyone. He never married a white woman. Yep. He didn't have any white girlfriends or white relationships, but he had a series of relationships with Black women over the course of his life. But Julia Chinn was actually the most important of these relationships. He was with Julia Chinn for 23 years. He referred to her as his wife. They openly lived together on his plantation in Kentucky, Blue Spring Farm. They had 2 daughters together who he acknowledged and who he raised as his children. And this is not a secret relationship. He's not hiding Julia and his daughters, Imogene and Adeline, in the slave quarters. Unlike Thomas Jefferson, who everybody wants to sort of say, oh, this is like Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I'm like, no, not really. Jefferson never acknowledges his relationship with Sally Hemings. He never acknowledges his children with Sally Hemings. This is like a very hidden relationship, right? Even though everyone in Virginia kind of knows what's happening, Jefferson doesn't talk about this. Richard Johnson and Julia Chinn live together. They are openly in a relationship. He calls her his wife. He doesn't have a white wife in the big house and Chinn in the back. This is his only family, right? And they're together for almost a quarter century. And because he lives in DC for 6 months every year as a full-time politician, it's Chinn who is the wife and the plantation mistress. She holds the keys to the plantation. She has access to the finances and the accounts. She has control over the slave laborers. She runs the house and the plantation just like a white wife and plantation mistress would, and everyone in the area knows that. She actually hosts all the large parties and functions that happen when Johnson is home. The Marquis de Lafayette comes to visit, former sitting presidents come to visit, and he doesn't hide her. He doesn't hide their daughters. So this is a relationship. This is a open relationship. People in Washington, D.C. know about it. When the daughters grow up, he gives them money, he gives them land, he gives them slave laborers, large estates. He actually arranges marriages for them with reputable white men from the area. Yeah, who know who these women are. It's not like it's a secret. So this is a very different relationship from the Hemings, Jefferson scenario, and Henry Clay, who's also a prominent 19th century plantation owner and politician who lives just down the street, quite literally, from Johnson, and who's his contemporary. Clay has a white wife. Clay also has all these side relationships with enslaved women on his plantation. But this is what most white men do in the era. They have, hidden relationships in the plantation, on the plantation in the quarters, but they have white wives and legal white relationships out front. Johnson, this is his only relationship. This is his only family. These are his children. This is his wife, and everyone knows it. So it's kind of I didn't expect this to become my book project. I sort of accidentally stumbled on it while doing research for teaching a class. Thought I would look into it later, and when I did, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole. And I said, somebody needs to write a book about this. Somebody needs to write a book about Julia and her daughters. And when I was talking to a colleague about it, because I was so stunned, she sort of looked at me funny and said, isn't this kind of what you do? Like, aren't these the kinds of books and essays that you write? Like, maybe you should write this book.
Yeah.
And I sort of thought to myself, oh my gosh, yeah, maybe I should. And it's taken me the better part of a decade to actually really pull this all together, because the source material is really fragmentary. Because even though Chinn and her daughters were both literate, they knew how to read, they knew how to write. There were letters going back and forth between Washington and Kentucky. But what happened is that Richard Johnson's brothers, after he died, they came along, and it's pretty evident that they destroyed all of Julia and her daughter's letters to Richard because they were ashamed and embarrassed about their brother's lifestyle choices. And so even though I have, Richard's letters to other people, I don't have his papers, his collection, his materials were basically set on fire. And so here's a 40-year career politician, and we don't have a massive Richard Mentor Johnson collection or library or vice presidential papers that we should have. And so I've spent the better part of a decade having to piece together his life and hers through other people's materials and papers, and through public records like census, tax, mortgage, real estate, newspapers, church materials. If it hadn't have been for newspapers and church records and things of that nature, it would have been very difficult to piece together their life. But he was such a public figure in the public eye that thankfully his brothers couldn't destroy all those other records that existed and literally erase her from the record in that way. But it's really heartbreaking to think of what we've lost, because all of her papers, all of her daughter's papers were basically went up in smoke because his brothers were trying to erase her and her daughters from memory.
Yeah. That's incredible. And when I started hold on. I have a kind of keep going in and out. Can you hear me fine, or is there an echo?
Yes, I can.
Okay. When I started really looking into this, I was fascinated with what you were just saying, how when Richard was away in Washington, Julia, she ran the show at the plantation. I mean, I read one account where it said he even used to tell his white workers to follow everything she says, just as if it was him there. Which is so very unusual, obviously. So it's interesting. Now, in all of your research, do you feel, I mean, I know obviously Richard Johnson did the same thing like you touched on with Thomas Jefferson, and many slave owners back in the day did. You know, they raped women, sexually assaulted their slaves, that sort of thing. But it seemed like he had some sort of real connection or relationship with Julia. If it was not illegal at the time, do you feel that he might have actually legally married her? Or do you think that it was just something that probably would not have happened because of the public outcry that would have happened, even if it was legal at the time?
I think that's a really fair question. I think it's also really important for us to understand that we don't know how Julia felt about this. Because we don't have her letters, we don't have her thoughts on the matter, we don't know how she felt about Richard. And it's really important to remember that he could have legally freed her. Kentucky didn't forbid that, and he never did.
I know he never did with her. He did after her death and the first daughter's death. He did legally free Imogene. Is that correct?
Well, here's what I've never been able to find emancipation or manumission records for either of his two daughters. But what essentially happens is that both Adeline and Imogene, they both, when they turn 18, they both marry white men, and both of them are granted enormous estates, literally within days of being married: land, laborers, cash, plantation property, etc. And that all of that estate is given to them jointly with them and their husbands. And so even though they're not given sort of formal emancipation papers, they're never from birth are they ever treated as enslaved people either. By virtue of, and so they're given formal education, they're given these estates, they're given legal marriages. So by virtue of their upbringing, by virtue of the estates that are granted to them, by virtue of how they're treated, they're essentially treated as if they are free people. And Adeline dies very young after only 3 years of marriage. Imogene, by virtue of, she's essentially treated as if she is a free person. And after the Civil War, all of the public records that she appears in, she appears as a white person. She's actually, all the records, they don't mark her as a free person of color, they mark her as a white person. And so she essentially passes over into the white community, as do all of her children. But Julia is never legally emancipated, and even her death records, she's marked as an enslaved person, the property of. And so I think it's really important for us to understand the power dynamics here. We don't, even though certainly Richard gives her a lot of power and a lot of privilege, she certainly runs the plantation as a white wife would have when her husband was away, including having authority over enslaved laborers, including having authority over white workers on the plantation who were told to, follow her authority. We don't know how she felt about Richard. We don't know how she felt about being placed in this position. And certainly we have to understand that at the end of the day, how much choice did she have in this matter, right? Yeah, she's a Black woman and she's an enslaved woman. Did she have any choice? Did she have the ability to say no to him? Yeah. Right? Did she have the ability to walk away and choose a different partner and choose a different lover, choose a different husband? Because if she had real freedom and real choice and real liberty comes with the ability to say, no, I don't want this and I don't want you, I want someone else. And what would have happened if she had done that? And so I really, really want us to keep those constraints that she had upon herself right at the front and center of our minds as we think about her life and as we read this book, because she didn't have the ability to say no. She did the best she could with what she had, and what she was able to do was make a better life for her daughters than she ever was able to make for herself. They had legal marriages, estates, formal education, and freedom, which she never had.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point, because I was reading something where Johnson, obviously, he had, affairs and, sexual relationships with other enslaved women. And I guess there was one enslaved woman that he had a relationship with, and she was, I guess, having a relationship with another man. He found out about it. And because he found out about it, he sold that woman at auction. So, I mean, that kind of just goes to show that he probably, like you said, Julia had no choice. And I'm sure he would have never given her the freedom or the liberty to make her own choices, is probably a good assumption.
Right. So I do think it's fair to say that his relationship with Julia was different from the other ones that we know about that come after her death. Mm-hmm. A long-standing relationship of almost a quarter century. There's no records that I found that suggest that he had any other relationships necessarily while she was still alive. It appears to have been, a more, at least from what we can find, a monogamous relationship, at least that from what I've been able to uncover. But the relationships that come after her death appear to be quite different. They appear to be more coercive. They appear to be more violent. They appear to be more traditional in terms of the ones we're more used to reading about that happened between slave owners and enslaved women, where women are not necessarily have any kind of say in the matter. And women who run away, women who make it very clear that they're not interested in being in this relationship, women who are hunted down, women who are brought back, women who are beaten, women who are sold. Where that doesn't seem to be the parameters of his relationship with Julia. But just because we don't see that kind of violence occurring doesn't mean that there were not coercive elements in this relationship. One of the things that I also point out is the fact that there was a large age gap between Chinn and Johnson. And so when we think about coercion, just because there wasn't physical violence doesn't mean that there weren't coercive elements in the relationship.
Yeah, excellent point. So last two things I want to ask you, because I don't want to keep you too long, but I was fascinated with this point and I thought about it. I want to get your opinion on it. So Julia died in 1833. Now Richard, he took over as vice president 4 years later in 1837. Mm-hmm. Now my mind just goes immediately to this. What would have happened in your opinion? Let's say Julia's still alive, Richard becomes vice president, and for some reason Martin Van Buren dies and Richard takes over as president of the United States. Do we have our first lady as an enslaved black woman? I mean, this is what's so fascinating to me, that your book's title, the Vice President's Black Wife. So what do you think would have been the overall, public opinion if, say, that scenario ever would have played out? I mean, is she even recognized as first lady, being an enslaved woman? And, even though they're not legally married, it's kind of a common law marriage and that sort of thing. So what happens, do you think, in that sort of situation if it would have played out?
No, I think it's a fair question. I mean, there are oral accounts that say that Richard and Julia actually did have a wedding ceremony. And that's something that I do talk about in the book. I also think that, you're talking about hypotheticals, obviously, but given how hard the opposition worked to not have him elected, and given the schism that it caused in his own party, and how close they came to not even nominating him as Van Buren's running mate, even though Julia was already deceased, I think that had she been alive, I don't think that he would have been Van Buren's running mate. I think it would have been a non-starter. Because Van Buren himself did not want Johnson as his running mate. He went to Andrew Jackson and basically said, look, this is going to be problematic. And it was Andrew Jackson who said, look, this is my guy. And Jackson, of course, is hugely influential. He's the outgoing president, has huge sway over the party, but it causes enormous division within the Democratic Party, right? His own party is divided. They don't really like the guy because of his unseemly private life. So the Democratic convention is very divided. Even though Julia is dead and gone, lots of people internally don't want him because of the fact that it's not because he had sex with a black woman. It's because he was open about his relationship with a Black woman. Because lots of these characters were having sex with Black women. Let us be very clear. It's they were very, very clear that if he had only been discreet, the voters would have forgiven him almost anything. That is a direct quote. That is a direct quote. The newspapers had a field day with this, but internally the Democrats said the same thing. They were like, we don't care what he chooses to do behind closed doors, but couldn't he just shut up about it? Right? So this was the problem. So your question basically goes to the heart of this whole conversation that I have throughout my book, but also in chapter 6, which is like about the election. Internally in the Democratic Party, but externally during the election across the nation, they keep digging up Julia's body to crucify her over and over again in order to kill him politically. He barely wins the election. He would have never even won the nomination had she still been alive, because what they keep saying over and over again, the other political party, but even internally, is, do you want an amalgamationist as your vice president? Because that's the word they used back in the day, was not miscegenationist, but amalgamationist. Do you want an amalgamationist, somebody who's having sex with a Black woman, as your vice president? It's too close to the Oval Office, because if Van Buren dies, then he ends up in the Oval, and then you end up with two biracial children who are fully grown women with children of their own, by the way, at this point. Do you want two, quote unquote, they used all kinds of nasty terms that I'm not going to use, but do you want two, multiracial, biracial, amalgamated children in the White House, et cetera, et cetera? And then, of course, it gets even worse, because he then takes up with other Black women and continues his, interracial sexual relationships, and it just becomes an ongoing problem. And that's why, of course, he doesn't get the nomination the second time around, because Jackson realizes this is a losing horse. We can't keep having him tied to the party, because he can't. He's just like dragging the whole party down, because he just cannot keep this. He just can't stay away from Black women, and he can't keep it quiet.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So, one last thing. First of all, I want to mention your first book. Name of that book is Forging Freedom: Black Women in the Pursuit of Liberty in Antebellum Charleston. I guess that came out, 2011 that was actually published?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm definitely going to be leaving links to that in the description of the video that I put out, so go check that out, of course. And my last question to you, of course, we're Dead History. I travel all over the country looking at grave sites. And everything I look at, there's some speculation of maybe, and then there's some speculation of it's unknown. Is Julia buried where the Johnsons are buried, there at that Great Crossing or whatever little family cemetery, I guess, where his mother and father are buried, Richard Mentor Johnson's? Is there anything that you've come across in all your research and studies that says that Julia is possibly buried there with that family?
Well, you're making me give away, who's going to want to read my book?
Listen, I promise you, I told you, when this book comes out, you're coming back on, and we're gonna have a live stream, and we're gonna make sure this book is out there for everybody. But this is the big question for me, because I like to go see these places. So
no, I think you're hitting all the right questions, and I would also really encourage folks. I did publish an article which is part of the forthcoming larger book project. So if people are interested. And it talks about the church that the Johnsons attended, and about this whole issue about burial. And it came out in the Journal of African American History in 2020. If people want to sort of get a preview of the larger book project, I would really encourage them to read that article in the Journal of African American History. It came out just last year. And of course, Ferris and Ferris is going to be publishing the larger book in 2023. But one of the things that I've thought about a lot and I do talk about is burial. And the family attended Great Crossing Baptist Church, which is still there, just down the road, 2 miles down the road from Blue Spring Farm, where the family lived. And the church was founded by Richard's parents and a group of Baptists who all kind of came out from Virginia. Richard's parents, as founding members of the church, are buried in the small original graveyard. And you can go out and see the cemetery, which I did, and I've taken photographs of it. It's a it's a historic small, graveyard with gravestones dating back to, the 1700s and 1800s. Richard himself is not buried there. He's buried in Frankfurt, where a lot of dignitaries and politicians and famous people are buried in the state capital with a large, monument.
Oh, yeah. Huge. Yes.
Right, huge monument. So his parents and aunts and uncles and other parent folks are buried at Great Crossing. He's the state cemetery in Frankfurt. His one daughter, Imogene, is buried with her husband on their land, on their property, just across at the Pence family farm. Right, her married name was Pence. So Richard, of course, had given Imogene and Adeline both property when they got married, as I mentioned. So Imogene and Daniel, her husband, are both buried on the Pence family property, just across the Elkhorn River, about a mile away from Blue Spring. Now, Adeline was actually given Blue Spring. That was the property she was given when she got married. Right. So Imogene was given land just across the creek. Adeline was given the homestead property, Blue Spring. And she passed away during that nasty vice presidential election. Mm-hmm. So Julia passes away in 1933 during a cholera epidemic. Adeline during the vice presidential election itself in 1936. We don't know exactly where Adeline or her mother Julia are buried, but at that time period, what was common was for family members to be buried on their home site property, on their plantation property. That's why Imogene is buried next to Daniel on their farmland. Mm-hmm. So it would be most likely for Julia and Adeline to both be buried on Blue Spring. That would follow tradition. Okay. That would be most common, especially because that little tiny cemetery at Great Crossing is, first of all, super tiny. It's generally only like sort of the founding family members whose graves are found in that little itty bitty cemetery. And it's all white folks who are found in that cemetery. I would bet a year's salary that you will not find Adeline or Julia in that cemetery because they're Black. I don't care how forward-thinking or progressive they may have been in some ways, that you will not find them buried there. And I also think simply because of how, like I said, people buried their kinfolk, their family, their husbands, their wives, their children on their home site property. And so, especially because Julia died from cholera during that cholera epidemic of 1933, when so many people were passing away all at once, it would have made even more sense for her to be buried on the home property at that point, at that time. So Richard also would have wanted to keep Adeline close. Like, he was very close to his daughter. He was devastated when she passed away so suddenly at such a young age. And so there would have been, on that property, there would have been a graveyard for enslaved laborers. There would have been a graveyard for the Choctaw Academy students, for the Native American students who died unexpectedly, especially during the cholera epidemic. And there would have been a graveyard for family members. So we don't know right now where those graveyards are, because it was the Blue Spring property was like several thousand acres. And the main house has disappeared. There's only foundation stones, and the property now belongs to 4 different sets of individuals, and everything, like, it's just sort of large stretches of grassland. And so we would need to bring in ground penetrating radar, and we would actually need to have it x-rayed to see where the bodies are, quite literally, right? So that's one of the things that we're hoping to do, is sort of have the ground x-rayed and to see where the actual cemeteries are, because all the headstones and everything have disappeared. And then we can actually mark those out and hopefully find where the bodies are quite literally buried.
Wow. Well, that is fascinating. And I hope that you get to do all that. And when you do, we're definitely going to have another conversation. But Dr. Myers, I want to thank you so very much for your time. This has been very gracious of you. And I also not only want to thank you for your time, I want to thank you for all you do. I have an 8-year-old son. I am not a history major or anything like that. I just love history. But this is the part of history that I really want my son to learn, and I want everybody to learn. I think it's very important. This is the history of people that, like you said, are almost forgotten. And it's they have some incredible stories, some very sad stories. And I thank you for bringing things like this to light, because I think it's very important. So I want to thank you very much. And again, thank you so much for your time. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. We'll definitely have you back on when the book comes out, because I would love to talk to you about it after I read it. And again, thank you so very much for your time, Dr. Myers.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show. It's a pleasure. And for the work that you're doing to bring dead history back to life. So it takes all of us.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you again.
Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History. So I figured I would just give you a quick audio before each bonus clip. Obviously, as you guys just heard, absolutely incredible, amazing. I know it was, little long, 30 plus minutes, but I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Myers. Absolutely fascinating to me. Really enjoyed that. So what I wanted to show you guys, I was considering going to Kentucky tomorrow, actually. I was going to make it's about a 10-hour drive or so for me one way. I was going to make the drive, see some stuff, stay one night overnight, and then drive back. But there's really no need for me to do so, because as you heard from Dr. Myers, and I'll explain more in a second, Julia Chinn's probably not buried where there's some speculation that she might be buried. She's definitely probably not there. She's probably on the grounds of the Blue Spring Farm, which was the Johnson family plantation land. So yeah. So I'm not going to make the trip down there, just to kind of see open grassland that I probably really even couldn't get too close to. So what I'm going to show you, these are all stock photos. What you're going to see is all stock. These are all not my photos. These were photos that were found online. Other people have taken these photos. So the first group of photos you're going to see, this is Blue Spring Farm. These are the remnants of the buildings still left on Blue Spring Farm. Blue Spring Farm is right in Great Crossing, Kentucky, which is near Georgetown, Kentucky. This is the Johnson family plantation home. This is where Richard Mentor Johnson lived. This is where he grew up. This is where his family plantation home was. Most of these buildings have pretty much gone away over the years, and as you heard Dr. Myers say, the actual big house, the family actual home, the only thing that remains of that is pretty much just foundation work. So yeah. So these pictures are just other buildings on the grounds. A lot of this also is the Choctaw Academy that Richard Mentor Johnson started. That's some of these buildings. The Choctaw Academy was the Native American school that Richard Mentor Johnson started. So here you go. Take a look. These are all photos of that, what you're seeing on your screen as I'm speaking. And there'll be probably a few after I'm done talking. And take a look here. All these are Blue Spring Farm, the Johnson family plantation. So now these next photos you're going to see, and probably what you're seeing on your screen now, these are the Great Crossing Cemetery. So the Great Crossing Baptist Church, as you heard Dr. Myers speak of, that is actually the church that Richard Mentor Johnson's parents founded and started with some other people. And this is the little cemetery that is right near there. And this is basically, this kind of houses Colonel Robin Johnson, which is Richard Mentor Johnson's father, his mother, Jemima Suget Johnson, even some of his siblings are even here at the Great Crossing Cemetery. For example, I know for a fact that James Johnson is here. I'm pretty sure Robert Johnson is here. Robert Johnson Jr. is here. There's several Johnson family members that are buried here in this little cemetery here, the Great Crossing Cemetery. Now, this is the cemetery, so everyone knows, that I spoke about to Dr. Myers, where there is speculation, very few. I mean, you can only really find it, to be honest with you, probably mostly on Find a Grave only, where there's speculation that Julia Chinn is buried here amongst the Johnson family members. However, as you heard Dr. Myers speak on, that's pretty much absolutely almost impossible. Being that she was a black woman, an enslaved person, it's almost guaranteed that both her and their first daughter are not here. There's no way that they're probably here. As a matter of fact, as was touched on, it was probably the first pictures I showed you on Blue Spring Farm, where both children and I'm sorry, not both children, their first child, Adeline, and then also Julia Chinn are probably buried. It's probably on the Blue Spring Farm property somewhere. Obviously, it is not here. Their first born child, Adeline, and of course Julia. Speculation was like, oh, they're maybe here with the Johnson family. No way. I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Myers. I thought it was a little peculiar when I had saw it written, and I was like, it just doesn't make sense. Why would they be there of all places? So I definitely don't think so. I definitely think, just like Dr. Myers does, that, Adeline, who was their first daughter, and Julia Chinn are both on the Blue Spring Farm and not here at the Great Crossing Cemetery. But all these pictures you've been seeing as I'm talking, this is the Johnson family. There's pictures of the gravesite of his father, his mother, and other siblings and such are buried here as well. So, Richard Mentor Johnson himself is not buried here. He's at Frankfort Cemetery, which I'm going to show you pictures of soon. But here you go. That's what you're looking at here. The Johnson family at the Great Crossing Cemetery here in Kentucky. And then we move over to the Pence family farm. So the Pence family farm, just so everyone knows, Daniel Brown Pence, he was actually the husband of Imogene Malvina Johnson Pence. So Imogene Johnson was Julia Chinn and Richard Mentor Johnson's second child. She survived both her mother and her sister. Both died long before Imogene. And Imogene outlived... did she outlive her father? I believe she did, actually. Let me just double check. Yes, she did. She did. By quite some time, she outlived her father. Her father died. Richard Mentor Johnson died in 1850, and Imogene didn't die till 1883. So she survived him by many, many decades. But the Pence family farm, which was owned by Daniel Brown Pence and the Pence family, there's a very small private little cemetery on this farm where Imogene Johnson is buried, along with her husband Daniel Pence, and a few other people, Malvina Pence Lee, and Daniel Brown Pence, and a few people. So these are photos that you're seeing of the Pence family farm cemetery. It is on private property. It's in Scott County, Kentucky. You can't get on there. It's supposedly the owner of this farm is not overly friendly to people coming on. So these are all stock photos that I took from online, mostly from Find a Grave. And but this is, you'll see here, if you slow down some of the pictures that are playing as I'm speaking, you will see Imogene's gravesite, her marker and her headstone there in these pictures. So there you go. That is what you've been seeing here on the screen. And last but not least, we move on to good old Richard Mentor Johnson's gravesite. Richard Mentor Johnson, of course, was the 9th Vice President of the United States. He died on November 19th of 1850. He was 70 years old, and he is buried in the Frankfurt Cemetery there. Dr. Myers called it the State Cemetery because it is right across. You'll see from a couple of these photos I'm showing too on the screen. It is right across this kind of like river or creek or whatever it may be from the state capitol building there in Kentucky. So it's a nice cemetery, really big, huge memorial monument for Richard Mentor Johnson. These are all the photos that I took. Of course, from my visit there last year, but this is Richard Mentor Johnson's gravesite in Frankfort, Kentucky at the Frankfort Cemetery. So, take a look, enjoy. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed this bonus footage. This was awesome. Way to be back. I hope this was a big comeback type video series for you. I look forward to next week. Thanks, guys.